fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Because Progressive offers discounts for paying in full, owning a home, and more. Plus, you can count on their great customer service to help when you need it, so your dollar goes a long way. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save on car insurance. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations.
I'm Laurah Norton, and this is One Strange Thing, the show where we search the nation's news archives for stories that can't quite be explained. Strangers. We're familiar with plenty of monster stories here on the podcast. Some are tied to specific events that we've traced through the news, like the 24 or so Bigfoots that ran rampant through the U.S. in the 1970s. Others, though, they're sometimes more complex to track, mostly because their origins are caught up in the quilt of local folklore. And one of the best places to start tracing a monster tale is in the legend and lore of the Ozark Mountains. Now, we dipped our toe into the weird world of the Ozarks a few episodes back when we brought you the dark history of the Crescent Hotel. But, of course, that's not the kind of story the region is most famous for, not by a long shot. Rather, it's the monsters that have made the biggest impact. The Ozarks might just be our country's richest breeding ground for cryptids, and the overlap between folklore, belief, and events that have wriggled their way into the news, it is surprisingly broad. Why does this region produce so many interesting creatures? Well, according to Vox, quote, location has a significant impact on folklore. As the folklorists they interviewed explained, quote, in the Ozarks, residents are generally more isolated, leaving them more likely to encounter wildlife. So, isolation plus exposure equals folklore, often built around the concepts of real creatures, bears, lizards, big cats, that are given a tall-tale twist. That's probably why the monsters of the Ozarks aren't just appealing to cryptozoologists. They're the subject of serious folklore study. We've come across articles about librarians designing exhibits dedicated to the creatures in places like Springfield, Missouri, and scholarly papers and books on Ozark tales that date back to at least the first half of the 20th century. For instance, in 1950, famed Arkansan folklorist Vance Randolph, he wrote the seminal book on the topic titled We Always Lie to Strangers. He commented on the role of monsters in Ozark lore. In part, he opened an essay on the area's monsters as follows, quote, there are many legends of gigantic beasts and mythical varmints in the Ozark country. It may be that credulous backwoodsmen believe some of them even today, but I wouldn't know about that. At any rate, the stories are still in circulation. Some of these items seem to be local, confined to certain clans or family groups. Others are much more widely known and have been published in the newspapers. So even back then, folklorists had tracked the tales in a few different directions. Local lore and the more widespread and formal vehicle of the press. And that bit is important. Coverage by reporters helped keep the monsters alive. So much so that you can find books and viral videos and articles dedicated to them to this day. And there are a lot of creatures to keep up with. In the mid-20th century, Vance Randolph compiled a roster of the Ozark's most distinctive creatures. And many of them are still mentioned today as part and parcel of the region's history. In fact, in October of 2024, Northwest Arkansas Daily published an extensive list of some of the most well-known Ozark cryptids, like the hinge-tailed Bing Buffer, a, quote, large hippo-like beast, or the side-hill hoofer and the snoffus, which are both deer-like creatures. And there's the aptly named Ozark howler, a, quote, shaggy animal resembling a mix between a panther, a canine, and even a bear. It's known for its, quote, mournful howl, a sound said to echo through the night, sending shivers down the spines of those who hear it. The howler is often treated as an omen. Though, of what? Well, opinions are mixed. It might portend death. A lot of things seem to, don't they? But our very favorite might be the Gowrow, or the Gowrow depending on the source. Per the Northwest Arkansas Daily, you should imagine something like, quote, a lizard-like beast stretching around 20 feet in length with giant tusks. Vance Randolph also noted that, quote, there's a persistent report that Gowrows hatched from soft-shelled eggs as big as beer kegs. He noted that the monster was, of course, a carnivore, and it might eat people. Reports, again, are mixed. That's not exactly the kind of beast you'd expect from Arkansas, right? But the creature, which allegedly hides out in caves and is often compared to a wingless dragon, it's deeply embedded in the state's lore and in its archival news. So far back, in fact, that the references date to at least the late 19th century, which isn't necessarily surprising for the region. After all, many of the Ozark Monsters made their first public appearance in tall tales involving the actually-was-a-real-person frontiersman Daniel Boone. But the Gowrow, it seems to have made its big splash in the news and not around the campfire. Randolph mentioned that stories might date back to the 1880s, but the earliest mention we got our hands on was from 1897 in an article that appeared in the Arkansas Gazette, formerly known as the Daily Arkansas Gazette. It was even accompanied by an illustration of the Gowrow, one that was allegedly based on a photo, or so they said. We will post it on our social media so that you can really gain appreciation for the image. So, this article, published in January of 1897, purports to cover the harrowing adventure of a Mr. William Miller of Little Rock, a businessman who found himself traveling through Searcy County in the northwestern area of the state. He claimed that while on his trip, specifically while in Calf Creek Township, he ran into the Gowrow. Per the Gazette, he'd allegedly heard tale of it before, but he figured being in town was the perfect chance to explore the legend. He claimed that the monster had been running rampant and slaughtering domestic animals, and that townsfolk could hear its cries at night. That unholy noise sounded something like, Gowrow, Gowrow. Thus, of course, giving it its name. Miller apparently recounted that, quote, the Gowrow has terrorized the community for several months, but though numerous attempts have been made to capture it, all of them have proved unsuccessful. The animal would steal down from the mountains at night and commence its depredations. He would break into cow sheds and kill and devour the cows and calves. Several times, he'd been interrupted in his bloodthirsty work, but he always managed to escape, carrying one of his victims with him. So, William Miller, who was apparently a very fearless businessman, decided to rally up a posse and go searching for the beast. They followed its big old lizard footprints, and they eventually found themselves at a rather ominous cave. And what was in that cave? A bunch of flowers. No, sorry, just kidding. There were a lot of skulls, and many of them belonged to humans. Now, at that point, we would personally turn around and head back to Little Rock, but retreat was not on William Miller's mind. Now, there was no monster present in the cave that they discovered, but they were pretty sure that one would return. So, William Miller and the posse decided to hide and wait. According to the Arkansas Gazette, they were soon rewarded by the sight of a great and terrifying beast crawling out of a nearby body of water. Apparently, they got a pretty good look at it, because the details in the article are, well, detailed. Quote, its head was ponderous in size and resembled somewhat that of a man, only 2 enormous tusks projected over the underlip. Its legs were short and thick and terminated into a webbed foot, which somewhat resembled that of a duck's, only each toe was capped by a vicious-looking claw. Its body was covered with enormous scales, while along its back bristled a series of sharp horns, which came to an abrupt end near the root of the tail. The tail was thin and long and was provided with a sharp bone at the end, which the Gowrow could wield as a sickle, and when enraged, would prove a formidable weapon. And what did the posse do? Well, they all fired their guns at it, and then it died. Kind of anticlimactic, sorry about that. And then the posse chopped up the creature with axes, and William Miller immediately returned to Little Rock, as one does. As he opined in the Gazette, quote, "In all probability, the specimen was the last of its kind, and I regret very much that it was killed, as it would have been of vast interest to scientists, and would have afforded a rare opportunity for gathering trustworthy information as to the characteristics of prehistoric animals. I have, however, made arrangements for the gathering of its bones and for their shipment to the Smithsonian Institute at Washington." Not a bad story, right? Apparently it was popular because it was followed up by a slew of other articles, mostly in the Gazette. A February 2nd article noted that, quote, "Mr. William Miller's report of the killing of a strange and terrible animal called the Gowrow in Searcy County, printed in Sunday's Gazette, caused no little talk among local scientists and the members of the Arkansas General Assembly, especially the lawmakers who represent Searcy County. Those representatives, named Moose and Bratton, they were quite surprised to learn of such a reign of terror in Searcy. It is the sort of thing that you'd think constituents might bring up to powerful men. Actually, Bratton, he must have thought about that because he issued a very lengthy statement calling the whole story a fake and an insult to the county at large. When William Miller received that intel, he was surprised and offended and said that, quote, "He did not anticipate anyone not believing the report of his great discovery, as he saw the animal killed and took a picture of him which appeared in the Gazette." At that point, his plan for the Smithsonian was reinforced because Miller was, quote, "of a scientific turn of mind, and he wanted his discovery to receive the proper attention." And by the 5th of that month, the paper had received a letter to the editor encouraging the county to retroactively reward Miller a $500 bounty on the Gowrow, which is about $19,000 today. But not everyone was impressed. We already mentioned the politicians. And within a day, the Gazette ran a quote from another paper, the Saline County Times, that offered this editorial opinion. Quote, "The most fishy of all tall tales we ever met, the one in Sunday's Gazette by Mr. Miller of the killing of a horrible animal called the Gowrow, takes the cake. The only wonder is that he didn't tell a story that somebody would have given credence to." And by February 6th, the Gazette was also running satirical letters to the editor that treated the whole affair as an obvious joke. And as for evidence of follow-through, well, as Folklore's Vance Randolph later wrote, quote, "When hard-pressed, Miller once declared that he had shipped the Gowrow's skin and skeleton to the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., but a newspaper man who queried the officials at the Smithsonian was unable to confirm this claim." And well, that makes sense, because the original article, though told from William Miller's first-person perspective, it may have actually been written by a reporter for the paper named Elbert Smithy. That's according to the Encyclopedia of Arkansas, which also reported that Fred W. Alsop, who edited the Arkansas Gazette at the time, eventually dismissed the whole thing. He apparently called it, quote, "a great fake, probably without foundation in fact." Did he know that at the time of publication? Well, he didn't say. But years later, when Vance Randolph asked him about the Gowrow story, he reported that Alsop, quote, "laughed and said that all he knew of the Gowrow was what he read in the Missouri newspapers." Which is interesting, since we read about it in his newspaper. In any case, pretty early on, it was clear to state lawmakers, to sarcastic locals who wrote into the papers, and we guess to the news editor himself. The story was probably a fabrication, which isn't exactly unique, especially in an era where yellow journalism was at its peak and wild stories could be printed without much blowback. It figures then that the tale would fade as quickly as the fabrication was devised. It would figure, except for one strange thing. The Gowrow, it did not go away. In fact, it embedded itself in Ozark creature culture, and stories and sightings have continued, yellow journalism or not. We already told you about Vance Randolph's work. In the early 1950s, he counted the creature amongst established folk monsters in the Ozark region, and not just based on what he'd read. He spoke to locals who swore that they knew of folks who'd had encounters with the Gowrow. For instance, an elderly Arkansas native, he told Vance Randolph that his family had had run-ins with the Gowrow, and he defended that information as true. Don't have to see something, he figured, to believe it exists. He explained, "I ain't never seen a painter neither, but lots of old-timers did see painters and killed 'em right here in this county. I've listened at them old hunters a-talkin', and there ain't no doubt in my mind that there was plenty of painters here in the early days. Well, my grandpa heard about the Gowrow, just like I've heard about the painters." Now, in case you are feeling confused about the lack of painters available in the Ozarks, he meant panthers or big cats. It's a phrase we've heard a lot in Appalachia, too. And his point was fairly made, if based on family rumor. We are asked every day to believe in things that we've never, ever seen. So, why not a giant carnivorous lizard? One tale that's floated around for, well, nearly 100 years now, is of an expedition made by folks who swear they ran into a Gowrow. The best version we've seen was recounted in 1958 in the Southwestern American. The author, famed Ozark historian Otto Rayburn, he told the story of an alleged encounter that probably took place in the late 1920s or early 1930s. He wrote of a place called Devil's Hole in Boone County, Arkansas, basically a spot that was a chasm inside a cave, right in the hillside and, quote, 20 feet in diameter. The owner of that particular land where the cave sat, he reported that he'd actually explored the hole. Why people do these things, we will never know. But he gave up when he climbed down 200 feet and he hadn't reached the bottom. That's also when he ran out of rope, so it was a consideration. Anyway, some other people decided that they should also try and see what was at the bottom of this very deep and mysterious chasm. And, per Rayburn, they attempted it between the Great Wars. The whole experience was written up in various publications by the group's leader, Cleo Harper. According to Rayburn, the group brought along 1,000 feet of cord, better to be prepared, and decided to do a test first. They decided on, quote, a heavy flat iron to be, quote, tied to the end of the rope and thrown into the opening. Well, that iron seemed to land on a ledge about 200 feet down. And then, well, quote, the party of the intrepid explorers at the mouth of the cave heard a vicious hissing sound, as if it were some angry animal whose den had been rudely intruded. The rope was pulled up, and it was found that the handle of the iron was bent. Jim, their guide, swore he could see marks of teeth upon it. At that point, you might assume that they'd gotten a pretty clear answer on whether the depths should be further plumbed, but we guess they felt committed to the bit. Rayburn wrote that they then lowered down a large rock, with similar results, aka teeth marks, and then finally, on their third attempt, pulled up a rope that had been bitten cleanly in half. A retired journalist who was conveniently along for the trip pointed out the similarities to William Miller's account from 1897 and wondered aloud if, perhaps, quote, the Gowrow had only feigned death and as soon as the murderous posse left, had migrated to Devil's Hole, where it had lived ever since. Which would be pretty impressive if Miller hadn't gone to great lengths to describe picking up its bones and sending them to a museum, or if any of it had been true to begin with. But the veracity of the story, it's less interesting to us than its staying power. And the Gowrow has survived. In books, in media, in stories about creepy caves and apparently appealing chasms across the Ozarks. And that is how folklore works. The seed germinates and grows into a plant that no one could have quite predicted. One with staying power. Sort of, we think, like kudzu, but that is the Southern American perspective. So fill in your own sturdy regional examples of choice. According to the American Folklore Society, that is kind of how it all works. The society noted that, quote, folklore is present in many kinds of informal communication, whether verbal, oral and written text, customary, behaviors and rituals, or material, physical objects. It involves values, traditions, ways of thinking and behaving. It's about art. It's about people and the way people learn. It helps us learn who we are and how to make meaning in the world around us. That all makes sense to us. One of your favorite episodes of this podcast, strangers, is about the legend of Bloody Mary. That is certainly folklore. But so is the elevator game. So is Slender Man, a creature whose creation we can easily trace through creepypasta and has yet become something more than it once was. And so the Gowrow, with its pretty concretely proven hoax origin, it is a part of that tapestry too. And maybe some people did believe, or they still do. That's what Vance Randolph heard from the locals who were familiar with the tale. Or maybe it's simply fun to think about the concept of an ancient, prehistoric-like lizard creature hiding out in the hills, waiting for a chance to nosh on something tasty. After all, as the Encyclopedia of Arkansas points out, tall tales are part and parcel of frontier history. They're myths told by people who were, in their own minds, traversing a strange and wondrous land. Why not make sense of it with giant lizards and terrible howling beasts? What is frightening to us can be transformed into entertainment if we stretch the edges far enough. And that stretching of edges, it is something that human beings have always done, especially when they gather around campfires, in the woods, at night, when the noises of nature are loud and alien. And they could be mistaken for just about anything. We hope you'll join us next time for another real-life story from the fine print of America's local papers. From the lives of regular people, just like you and me, except for one strange thing. One Strange Thing is an independent podcast. To support the show and to hear more of the entirely true and enticingly peculiar, you can check out our premium offerings. If you'd like to subscribe on Apple Premium, you'll get both premium and ad-free and early access episodes, along with ad-free early access to our other podcast, The Fall Line. If you subscribe to Patreon, you'll find ad-free early releases of our regular episodes, a monthly full-length bonus episodes, giveaways, and blog posts. We hope you'll check out one of these options and support the show. There's a link in the show notes. And if you enjoy One Strange Thing, please take a moment to leave us a great rating or review on your favorite podcast app. That really helps.